What happens when Hollywood royalty sits down for what should be a routine interview and finds themselves in the middle of an ambush? When one of the most respected actors in the world comes face to face with a host who seems determined to turn a simple conversation into a political battlefield? It only took 35 seconds of thinly veiled accusations before the entire set erupted into chaos, and what came next left everyone speechless. The morning started like any other day on the set of the popular daytime talk show. The lights were bright, the audience was buzzing with excitement, and the cameras were rolling. This was supposed to be a feel-good segment, the kind where a beloved celebrity talks about their latest project, shares a few laughs with the hosts, and maybe drops some behind-the-scenes stories that fans would love. But from the moment the guest walked onto that stage, something felt off. Denzel Washington, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, waved to the cheering audience as he made his way to the interview table. The crowd went wild. This was a man who had given them decades of incredible performances. From powerful dramas to heart-pounding action films, he was there to promote his newest movie, a project he had poured his heart into. The audience could barely contain their enthusiasm, but as soon as he sat down, the energy shifted. Joy Behar, one of the show's main hosts, greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something sharp about the way she looked at him, something that made the other hosts shift uncomfortably in their seats. The pleasantries were brief, almost perfunctory. Within seconds, it became clear that this wasn't going to be the friendly chat everyone had expected. "So Denzel," Joy began, leaning forward with an intensity that immediately put the audience on edge. "Your new film deals with some pretty heavy themes. Justice, morality, redemption, all important stuff. But I have to ask, given everything that's happening in our country right now, don't you think Hollywood has a responsibility to take a stronger political stance? Don't you think people like you need to use your platform to speak out more?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Denzel's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment. He took a breath before responding. "Well, Joy," he said, his voice measured and steady, "I think everyone has the right to express their opinions, but I also believe that my job as an actor is to tell stories, to show the human experience in all its complexity. I don't think it's my place to tell people what to think politically. I trust audiences to be intelligent enough to draw their own conclusions." It was a perfectly reasonable answer, respectful, thoughtful, and completely non-controversial, but Joy wasn't having it. Her face hardened, and she leaned back in her chair with a look that could only be described as condescending. "That's interesting," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "because it seems to me like that's a pretty convenient position to take when you're sitting on millions of dollars and living in your Hollywood bubble. Some of us don't have the luxury of staying quiet. Some of us actually care about what happens to regular people," the audience gasped. You could hear it ripple through the studio. Even the other hosts looked shocked. This wasn't a debate. This was an attack, and it was completely unprovoked. Denzel's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "With all due respect, Joy," he began, his voice still calm, but with an edge to it now. "I grew up in Mount Vernon, New York. My father was a preacher, and my mother worked in a beauty shop. I know exactly what it's like to be a regular person, and I've spent my entire career trying to give a voice to people who don't always get heard. So I would appreciate it if you didn't make assumptions about who I am or what I care about." It was a perfectly delivered response, firm but respectful, the kind of answer that should have ended the exchange and moved the conversation forward. But Joy wasn't done, not even close. She actually laughed. A sharp, dismissive laugh that made it clear she thought she was dealing with someone beneath her. "Oh, please," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You can talk about where you came from all you want, but at the end of the day, you're still part of the elite now. You go to fancy parties, you hang out with politicians and billionaires. When was the last time you actually spent time with regular working people? When was the last time you struggled to pay a bill?" The other hosts were frozen. They knew this had gone too far. One of them tried to interject, to steer the conversation somewhere, anywhere else, but Joy talked right over her. She was on a roll now, and there was no stopping her. "And another thing," Joy continued, pointing, her finger at Denzel like she was scolding a child. "You sit there and talk about letting audiences make up their own minds. But what about all the damage that kind of thinking does? What about when people make the wrong choice because they weren't given proper guidance? What about when silence is complicity?" Denzel stared at her for a long moment. The studio had gone completely silent. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. His hands were folded calmly on the table in front of him, but you could see the tension in his shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with barely contained frustration. "Joy," he said slowly, "I came here today to talk about a film that I care deeply about. A film that explores important questions about humanity and morality. I didn't come here to be lectured about my responsibility to tell people what to think. I didn't come here to be insulted or to have my character questioned. And I certainly didn't come here to be told that I don't understand what regular people go through." He paused, letting his words sink in. The audience was completely transfixed. Some of them were nodding along with him. Others looked horrified at what was unfolding. But everyone was paying attention. "I've given decades of my life to this craft," Denzel continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've played heroes and villains, leaders and followers, saints and sinners. And I've done it because I believe in the power of storytelling to help us understand each other better. But what you're doing right now, this isn't about understanding. This isn't about dialogue. This is about you using me as a prop to push your own agenda." Joy's face flushed red. She clearly hadn't expected him to push back this hard. Most guests on the show either went along with whatever the host wanted or tried to laugh off any uncomfortable moments. But Denzel wasn't playing that game. He had been pushed too far, and he was done being polite. "Now wait just a minute," Joy shot back, her voice rising. "I have every right to ask tough questions. That's what journalists do. That's what this show is about. If you can't handle a little scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye." "Tough questions?" Denzel repeated, his eyebrows raised. "Joy, you haven't asked me a single question about the film. You haven't asked me about the character I'm playing or the story we're telling. All you've done is attack my integrity and make assumptions about my life. That's not journalism. That's not even a conversation. That's just you being disrespectful." The audience erupted into applause. Not scattered, polite clapping, but genuine, enthusiastic applause. People were standing up, cheering for Denzel as he sat there calmly stating his case. It was clear whose side they were on, and it was clear that Joy had massively miscalculated. Joy tried to regain control. She held up her hands, trying to quiet the audience, but they weren't having it. They wanted to hear more from Denzel. They wanted him to keep going, and he did. "You know what the real problem is?" Denzel said, his voice cutting through the noise. "The real problem is that people like you think you have all the answers. You think you're so much smarter than everyone else, so much more enlightened, that you have the right to talk down to people who disagree with you. But that's not how the world works. That's not how people work. And frankly, it's exhausting." Joy's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She was completely flustered, unable to come up with a response. The other hosts were staring at their notes, desperately trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, but there was no salvaging it. The damage was done. "You want to know why so many people are fed up with Hollywood and the media?" Denzel asked, looking directly at Joy. "It's because of moments like this. It's because people are tired of being talked down to. They're tired of being told they're wrong for not thinking the right way. They're tired of celebrities and talk show hosts acting like they're better than everyone else." The studio was electric. People were on their feet, cheering and clapping. Some were even whistling. It was the kind of response you'd expect at a concert, not a daytime talk show. And through it all, Denzel sat there, his expression calm but resolute. He had said what needed to be said, and he wasn't backing down. Joy finally found her voice. "I think you're being incredibly unfair," she said, her tone defensive now. "I was simply trying to have a meaningful conversation about important issues. If you took offense to that, then maybe you're too sensitive." That was the breaking point. Denzel slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. The movement was deliberate, controlled. He adjusted his jacket and looked down at Joy with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and resolve. "You know what, Joy?" He said quietly. "I'm not too sensitive. I'm just not interested in being disrespected on national television. I came here in good faith to talk about something I care about, and you turned it into an attack. So I'm done." The audience went wild. They were cheering, clapping, shouting words of encouragement. Some were even chanting his name. It was pandemonium. And through it all, the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the meltdown. Joy looked panicked. "Denzel, please, let's just," she stammered, but he was already walking away. He thanked the audience with a wave, nodded politely to the other hosts, who looked mortified, and headed toward the exit. You could see producers scrambling backstage, trying to figure out what to do. This was live television, and their biggest guest of the week was walking off the set. Joy tried to play it off. "Well," she said with a forced laugh, "I guess he really is sensitive." But the joke fell flat. The audience wasn't laughing with her. They were still cheering for Denzel as he disappeared backstage. If anything, her comment made things worse. It made her look petty and vindictive, like she couldn't handle being called out. One of the other hosts, clearly trying to do damage control, jumped in. "I think we all need to take a breath here," she said, her voice soothing. "These are passionate topics, and sometimes conversations get heated. Let's go to commercial." But it was too late. The moment was already being clipped and shared across social media. Within minutes, hashtags were trending. People were taking sides, dissecting every word of the exchange. And the overwhelming consensus was clear. Denzel had been ambushed, and he had handled it with grace and dignity. Joy, on the other hand, had come across as condescending, disrespectful, and completely out of touch. Backstage, Denzel was surrounded by his team. They were upset on his behalf, but he remained calm. "It's fine," he told them. "I said what I needed to say. Now let's just get out of here." Security escorted him out of the building, past stunned crew members and starstruck audience members who had filtered out during the commercial break. Some of them approached him, telling him they were proud of him for standing up for himself. He thanked them politely and kept moving. Back on the set, the show was struggling to recover. When they came back from commercial, the energy was completely different. The other hosts tried to move on to lighter topics, but you could tell they were rattled. Joy sat there with a fixed smile on her face, but her eyes told a different story. She knew she had messed up. She knew that this moment would define the episode, maybe even define her for some people. What had started as a routine celebrity interview had turned into a full-blown confrontation, and the worst part for Joy was that she had brought it on herself. She had pushed and pushed, thinking she could bully a guest into agreeing with her, or at least looking weak if he didn't. But she had underestimated Denzel Washington. She had underestimated his integrity, his intelligence, and his willingness to stand up for himself. The interview that was supposed to last 15 minutes had barely made it to 7 before everything fell apart. 7 minutes of what should have been friendly banter had turned into a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview. And it all came down to one simple fact. Joy had approached the conversation with an agenda. She had decided before Denzel even sat down that she was going to challenge him, provoke him, push him into a corner. She had treated him not as a respected guest, but as an opponent to be defeated. And Denzel had refused to play along. He had refused to be bullied or belittled. He had stood his ground, spoken his truth, and walked away with his dignity intact. That's what made the moment so powerful. It wasn't about politics or ideology. It was about respect. It was about treating people with basic human decency, regardless of whether you agree with them or not. The audience had recognized that immediately. They hadn't been cheering for a political stance. They had been cheering for a man who had been disrespected and had the courage to call it out. They had been cheering for someone who refused to be talked down to, who refused to accept being treated poorly just because he was in someone else's studio. As the rest of the show limped along, trying desperately to pretend like nothing had happened, everyone in that studio knew the truth. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. They had watched a beloved actor refuse to compromise his principles for the sake of a television appearance. They had seen someone choose self-respect over publicity. And they had seen a host learn the hard way that not everyone will tolerate being treated with contempt. The exchange had been brief, but devastating. In those few minutes, Joy had revealed something about herself that no amount of damage control could undo. She had shown that beneath the jokes and the banter, there was an arrogance, a belief that she had the right to lecture and belittle anyone who didn't fall in line with her worldview. And Denzel had shown exactly why he's remained one of the most respected figures in entertainment for decades. Because when it mattered, when the cameras were rolling and the pressure was on, he chose integrity over everything else. The confrontation wasn't about winning an argument. It was about drawing a line. It was about saying, "I will not be treated this way." And that message resonated far beyond that studio. It resonated with everyone who had ever felt talked down to, dismissed, or disrespected. It resonated with anyone who had ever been told they were wrong for not thinking the right way. What made it even more powerful was how Denzel had handled it. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't cursed, he hadn't stormed off in a rage. He had simply, calmly, and clearly stated his case. He had pointed out exactly what was wrong with the situation and then made the decision to remove himself from it. That takes real strength. That takes real character. Meanwhile, Joy had done exactly what she had accused Denzel of. She had shown herself to be out of touch, sitting in her comfortable position on a popular television show, lecturing one of the hardest working actors in the business about responsibility and privilege. The irony was lost on her in the moment, but it wasn't lost on anyone watching. As the show finally ended and the camera stopped rolling, the crew began packing up. There was an awkward silence on set. People were avoiding eye contact, unsure of what to say. Joy sat in her chair for a moment, staring at nothing, before finally getting up and walking off. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't try to explain or justify what had happened. She just left. The other hosts gathered together, talking in hushed tones. They were trying to process what had just happened. Some of them were clearly upset, feeling like the show's reputation had been damaged. Others seemed relieved that someone had finally pushed back against Joy's tendency to dominate conversations and impose her views. In the green room, Denzel's publicist was fielding calls. Media outlets wanted statements. They wanted interviews. They wanted to know what happened from his perspective. But the answer was simple. Denzel had said everything he needed to say on camera. There was nothing to add, nothing to clarify. The moment spoke for itself. And as Denzel's car pulled away from the studio, as he sat in the back seat reflecting on what had just transpired, one thing was certain. He had come to that studio to talk about art, about storytelling, about the things he was passionate about. Instead, he had found himself in a situation where he had to defend his character and his choices. And he had done so with the same grace and dignity that had made him a legend in the first place. The talk show had wanted a moment. They had gotten one, just not the one they had planned for. Because sometimes, when you push someone too far, when you treat them with too little respect, they push back. And when that someone is Denzel Washington, when that someone has spent a lifetime earning the respect of millions of people through hard work and integrity, that pushback is going to resonate. The entire exchange had lasted less than 8 minutes, but those 8 minutes revealed everything anyone needed to know. They revealed a host who thought her position gave her the right to lecture and demean. They revealed a guest who refused to accept that treatment, no matter what it cost him. And they revealed an audience that knew exactly who was in the right. That's what happens when respect goes out the window. That's what happens when someone mistakes a platform for a pulpit and a conversation for a chance to score points. And that's what happens when they choose the wrong person to try it with. Because Denzel Washington didn't get to where he is by backing down. He didn't become one of the most respected actors of his generation by letting people walk all over him. And he certainly wasn't going to start now. When Denzel had walked onto that stage, he had been ready to be charming, funny, engaging. He had stories prepared about working with the director, about the challenges of the role, about what he hoped audiences would take away from the film. He had been looking forward to connecting with the audience and maybe even having a few laughs with the hosts. That was the kind of appearance this was supposed to be. But from the second Joy opened her mouth, it was clear that wasn't going to happen. Her first question hadn't really been a question at all. It had been an accusation dressed up as a question. And when Denzel had tried to give a thoughtful, nuanced answer, she had jumped down his throat. It was like watching someone deliberately try to start a fight. The other hosts had known immediately that things were going wrong. You could see it in their faces. They had exchanged nervous glances, shifted in their seats, tried to figure out how to intervene without making things worse. But Joy had been relentless. Every time someone tried to change the subject or lighten the mood, she had steamrolled right over them. One of the younger hosts had actually tried to ask Denzel about the film directly. "So tell us about your character," she had said, her voice almost pleading. "What drew you to this role?" It was a lifeline, a chance to get the conversation back on track. But before Denzel could even begin to answer, Joy had jumped in again. "Actually, before we get into that," Joy had said, completely ignoring her colleague, "I want to go back to what we were discussing. Because I think it's really important that we address this idea that celebrities shouldn't use their platforms. With everything going on in the world right now, how can you justify staying silent? How can you just make movies and pretend like none of the bad stuff is happening?" Denzel had taken a deep breath. You could see him choosing his words carefully, trying to be patient, even though it was clear he was getting frustrated. "Joy," he had said slowly, "I'm not staying silent. I'm telling stories. I'm creating art that I hope will make people think, make them feel, make them question things. That's my contribution. That's what I know how to do. And I think that's valuable. But is it enough? Joy had pressed, leaning forward aggressively. Is making a movie really enough when there are people suffering? When there are real injustices happening every day? Doesn't that feel a little selfish to you? A little self-indulgent? The audience had gasped again. It was such a brazenly disrespectful thing to say. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to his craft, who had given memorable performances that had moved millions of people, who had used his success to support countless charitable causes, and she was calling him selfish. It was outrageous. Denzel's expression had hardened at that moment. That was when you could tell he had made his decision. He wasn't going to keep trying to have a reasonable conversation with someone who was determined to be unreasonable. He wasn't going to keep defending himself against baseless accusations. He was done. "You know what, Joy?" he had said, his voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone. "I've been very patient with you. I've tried to answer your questions honestly and respectfully. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's not even a conversation. You're not interested in hearing what I have to say. You're just interested in making me look bad because I won't tell you what you want to hear." Joy had sputtered, trying to interrupt, but Denzel had held up his hand. "Let me finish," he had said firmly. "You want to talk about privilege and responsibility? Let's talk about it. You sit here every day with your platform, telling millions of people what they should think and how they should feel. You talk about caring for regular people, but when was the last time you actually listened to someone who disagreed with you? When was the last time you had a conversation where you didn't already know the answers you wanted to hear?" The studio had erupted. The audience wasn't just clapping anymore. They were cheering, whistling, standing up. Some people were pumping their fists in the air. It was like Denzel had said what they had all been thinking for years. And in a way, he had. He had given voice to the frustration that so many people feel when they watch these shows. When they see celebrities and media figures talking down to ordinary people, acting like they have all the answers. Joy's face had gone from red to pale. She had clearly not expected this level of pushback. Most guests, when confronted by her, aggressive questioning, would either get flustered and defensive or try to laugh it off and change the subject. But Denzel had done neither. He had met her head on, and he had won. "I think we need to take a commercial break," one of the producers had said, into the host's earpieces. But it was too late. The damage was done, and besides, this was the most compelling television they had aired in years. Part of them knew they should cut away, but another part knew this was the kind of moment that people would be talking about for weeks. That's when Denzel had stood up. The gesture was so simple, so decisive. He didn't make a scene. He didn't throw anything or shout. He just stood up, thanked the audience, and began to leave. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. It showed that he didn't need to make a big dramatic exit. His point had already been made. As he had walked off the stage, the audience had given him a standing ovation. Every single person in that studio was on their feet. Some had tears in their eyes. It was the kind of moment that gives you chills. The kind of moment where you witness someone standing up for what's right. And that was the thing. Denzel hadn't lost his temper. He hadn't been unprofessional. He had simply refused to accept being treated with disrespect. There's a difference between standing up for yourself and creating drama for drama's sake. Denzel had done the former. He had drawn a line and said, "This is not acceptable." And everyone watching had understood why. The show had limped through the rest of the episode. The host had tried to act normal, had tried to pretend like nothing catastrophic had just happened, but you could see it in their eyes. The energy was gone. The momentum was lost. And every person watching at home knew that this episode would be remembered for one thing and one thing only: the moment Denzel Washington walked off the set. The confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes from start to finish. 10 minutes that revealed so much about both people involved. 10 minutes that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. 10 minutes that prove once and for all that some people can be pushed, can be provoked, can be attacked, but they won't be broken. They won't compromise their dignity. They won't accept being treated as less than they deserve. And that's the real story here. Not that a talk show interview went wrong, not that a celebrity walked off a set, but that someone stood up for themselves when it would have been easier to just sit there and take it. That someone chose self-respect over publicity, chose integrity over image. That someone reminded us all that no matter how big the platform, no matter how bright the lights, some things are more important than playing along. Some things, like dignity and respect, are worth fighting for, even if it means walking away.